That's how beautiful you are.
Hello and welcome back to Philoma. This is part 5, where we are getting into some of the Hillside development. This is one of the more challenging aspects of this build, and so I'll be focusing on one small area, and then we'll be applying that to the rest of the city. Now you can see here I'm trying to choose an elevation in which I will not build above. I wanted this containment boundary mainly for the purpose of not having buildings going higher than the church. I figured there would be some lore around that in which the city never allowed people to build a building that would go higher than the top of the church. I think that is a thing that exists in some European cities, so that sounds somewhat plausible. And you can see they're placing down a couple of buildings at a chosen elevation just to test to see how high they would get, and then that would be where I would go from. So I'm gonna take the road all the way around the valley here, and I'll be back in a moment.
I used to look upon myself as rational and strong, and love was just a word in silly songs. But from that cursed day when you crossed my way, all my confidence was gone. I'm bewitched, bewildered, and utterly alone.
Now as I come around to this side of the valley, I realize that there's a point that actually dips lower than this, so I need to continue around the other side until I get to the marina. Okay, so we've got our road all the way in there, and you can see I now have this boundary for me to work within, and I will go through and I'll delete that road later. Now at this moment you're seeing my custom tree brush that I used for the forest behind the church. You may recall in the previous episode I mentioned I wanted these dense forests behind the church so that it would have more contrast from a couple of vistas. One was from the hotel that you're seeing me do now, and the other one was from the future star fort that would be at this location. And then I couldn't see it all, so I came through and I filled up the valley. And if we zoom in here, we can see we do have a nice thick forest there, so that you're not losing sight of the church in a bunch of buildings behind, but rather being able to see the whole thing because it's contrasted against that dark forest. So we're going to move over to the right side of the church and work in that area. And there's a hill there that we're going to build all around. I thought this would be a good spot for a villa. I do eventually move it because I find a better location for it. But what you'll see me do throughout this episode is you'll see a lot of pre-grading. Now I know you might think this isn't respecting the topography, but in this game, if you're building on terrain, especially hills, like not flat terrain, you're going to need to do pre-grading. And I use these 2 deep Mediterranean buildings because it'll allow me to get lots of density on the hills. If I used deeper buildings, it would require more space, and then it just wouldn't work out so well. So I used narrow roads, and I'm making a couple custom roads here because I do want parking. If I was just using the alley roads, I would have nowhere. There would be nowhere for anyone to park. So I created these custom roads. They're basically identical but opposite each other, and they have a sidewalk and parking on one side and then nothing on the other side. And so they would have a retaining wall or a quay wall on one side of them. So here you can see me putting down the first one, making sure that the parking and sidewalk are right up against the buildings. Now at the foot of the hill, I needed to fill in these odd-shaped blocks. So here I'm just going to quickly fill them in with some buildings. I'm not sure if I mentioned this in a previous episode, but I changed my shortcuts for Find It so that opening Find It was F, and then changing to a random building was R, and I found that made it really quick for me to just open it up and start plopping down buildings. Now I can unpause and make sure those roads are working. And yes, our buildings have power, electricity, and water and everything. Now I have a tunnel here that goes underground to the underground parking, and I needed to hide that somehow. So I came in with some buildings and tried to fill these tight gaps and also fit in a little plaza there. I added some pedestrian roads behind for added connectivity, and then plopped some other roads in as well. I considered putting some buildings right over top of the tunnel entrance, but it would have looked very strange, so I ended up not doing that. Now I added this pedestrian road that would ramp up to the next road there. I thought that would make a nice pedestrian connection. And of course there's a vehicle driving on it. Now I'm going to continue putting buildings down on the hill and wrapping around the corner there. The corners turned out to be some of the more challenging and interesting locations. Now at this point, you'll notice I'm realizing I only have my road in one direction, and it's not really working out for me. So this is when I made the second road that was opposite, with the parking and sidewalk on the other side. And it did end up making more sense to use those, and now doing a little more pre-grading and going to delete those roads and wrap up the hill here. I'm going to take this road around and try and wrap up towards the top of the hill on the backside there, and then bring this other road into a small T-junction that creates a couple little interesting plazas on the corners that I will eventually do some simple detailing on. I'm trying to get this road winding up and up and up around the top of the hill, and that last road there I will eventually convert to a pedestrian road and bring back down the other side. And this is when I realized that this villa would actually work really nicely on the top of the hill there, and it fit quite perfectly. Well, almost perfectly. You'll see that once I plop it down, some of the props and the grading don't really work so well, but that's what we've got Better Bulldozer for. So we can remove the fences and some of the props and the surfaces, and then detail it ourselves later. The hill there is looking pretty bad as well, so I decided to add a retaining wall, and it adds a little bit of extra land for that building and makes it look a lot nicer in my opinion. So now I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do with the rest of these spaces. So I flatten out behind the buildings and just smooth out some of the terrain to make these nice big retaining walls. And later I'll fill those spaces in with some trees. I did think about adding parking back there, but I would have needed roads and it would have got a little tricky. So trees ended up being the nice solution in the end. And then I'm going to come down the hill with more buildings as I go. And using Move It to fuse these buildings in nicely to each other. And a little bit of recolor as well to make some of the buildings a little brighter. Now the area where the tennis courts are, I thought would make a nice little neighborhood with a couple blocks for adding more density to the area. So I took the tennis courts and I moved them over to where the football field was, and then flattened out the rest of this area to make more room for development. Switching out some of the pedestrian roads for vehicle access and adding some more parking roads into the neighborhood, and starting to make some blocks where I would add in some buildings. And I wanted these blocks to have tight, awkward shapes. I didn't want them to just be rectangular. At least one of them ends up being more interesting. And they end up being quite small compared to some of the other blocks in the rest of the build, so they were more unique. I had to shift over this parking closer to the tennis court and try and prevent vehicle access through that pedestrian road as well. Using manipulation mode, I was able to make a nice smooth bend in the road and shift the parking over as well. This block is going to require a little bit of tweaking with Move It and getting the right assets in there. And then this other block was a little bit easier. It was just using these 2 deep assets and mostly corner units to try and fill it out. Going in with Move It to clean things up and make sure that all of the buildings smoothly transition to each other. After the buildings were in place, I wanted to continue the surface treatment using the brick surface throughout that's seen throughout the rest of the build. And I wanted this little neighborhood to feel like it was old. It's a more unique part of the community. So it has this brick surfacing throughout the whole area. I had to clean up the surface there as it was bleeding up the quay wall, and I was left with that little grass strip that I just covered up with some bushes. And then some simple detailing in the back with a little pool and a couple trees. And detailing the rest of the area up with some trees as well, and I'll come in after and put in the tree grates as necessary. Placing the trees and the tree grates with the same distance using line tool is very convenient. But when in doubt, you can also place them individually, and it works out just fine. There, I'm putting in a few planters to try and separate the 2 parking areas, and that was that area complete. So let's move on up the hill. On the corner, I wanted to include this unique building from the French region pack. And also that's another unique building that was a little more modern, but I kind of liked the contrast of having a modern building in there. It's almost as if there was an old building maybe that burned down or something, and so something more modern was built in its place. This awkward corner was, I thought, worth detailing and maybe turning this bottom level into a restaurant with some outdoor seating. So added a lot of foliage to clean things up, or rather hide some things. putting a tree on the corner, of course a tree grate, then some tables and fencing. Now the reason that I'm using some French assets in this build is that Napoleon Bonaparte was actually exiled to the island of Elba, and that's what this map is based on, if you didn't know that. And so I wanted kind of to include a little nod to history with using the French assets in this build. And I thought that that corner ended up looking really nice in the end. And I'm going to come in again with the buildings and wrap around up to the next level there. It does get a little bit repetitive as you're building up the hills, but you can always take opportunities to make breaks in the build, add extra pedestrian connectivity, make little plazas, fill in spaces with something unique here and there. And just going to clean up some of these buildings with Move It and try and line up the windows so that they don't get interrupted halfway through or have balconies in funny places. Doesn't always work out perfectly, but you can try. And also trying to line up the rooftops and make sure some of the windows or things line up well and don't interrupt each other. Now here I'm taking this road. I realized it didn't really go anywhere, so I turned it into a pedestrian road, and then it would curve back down the hill and connect down there. So tourists that were walking up the hill could go visit that villa. Perhaps it's not actually a private residence, but rather a tourist destination now. Maybe it belonged to somebody at some point, and then it was donated to the city and is now a tourist attraction rather than a private residence. And so tourists can walk up the hill there. Cleaning up some of the grading around it as well, just make it look a little better. So again, making these corner plazas look a little more interesting. I realized this building on the corner could be copied and then fused again to make more layers to it. It ends up looking almost like an octagon in the end. And then around the plaza, taking some rocks, making sure cars can't drive into the plaza, and placing down some seating, somewhere to eat, some shade, and just making the area look a little more unique. Simple detailing can sometimes go a long way. And then going to continue the red brick down the rest of the block so that we have this consistency throughout the rest of the build. Now, the other side of the street from that plaza, we're going to make another small plaza. It'll be much more simple than the other one. And here I'm going down the street and just putting in more of that red brick. If you missed it in the last one of the last episodes, I talked about how the lore for this island, having all this red brick, is that this brick is produced here, and so it's also used throughout the island and makes it one of the more unique features of this place. Okay, so moving to the back of the hillside, I needed to delete a couple of buildings and create a new road that would wind up. So here you can see me pre-grading, making sure that everything was going to be nice and smooth. Now that I finished my pre-grading, I'm just going to put down some roads that I will connect in a moment. and then smoothing out the terrain and making nice big retaining walls. They may be unrealistically big, but I will fill in some of the gaps between buildings with some trees later. Now deleting those 2 buildings so we can put in our new windy road. This ended up being one of the more challenging roads to plot buildings on because it was so tight and windy, but it also makes it more interesting. And that would be contrasted with this very straight, long road that meets up in this hill, and then to meet these 3 roads together, or to join these 3 roads together, I made a roundabout and made sure that it all connected nicely. Now here I'm putting down the UK Parish Church. I wasn't sure if it fit the build at first, but I did like how it looked, so I ended up keeping it. Plus, I did need death care in the area, so it also served that purpose. This build is functional. It's not entirely for just for looks, so I wanted to make sure that everything was also functional. And you'll see here, I'm noticing that if I were to put buildings on this little road, they'd be blocking the view of the villa. So I think it's reasonable to think that there was never any development on that stretch of road there. Then I'm going to bring more buildings back down the other side. Now coming up that windy road with some of these smaller buildings to try and get around these corners. Again, that was a little more difficult, so plopping them down and then coming in with Move It afterwards to adjust their locations. Trying to fuse these buildings on this corner was a challenge in its own. I tried not to think too much about it, and when you zoom out, it looks okay. This building on the corner I realized didn't have access on one side, so I had to change that road, and then I had space for one more building in between there. Now that I finished that road, I had these 2 blocks to fill in. I did have a deficit in education, so I decided to plop down an elementary school and add the upgrades to it as well. And then next to it on the corner, I thought I'd add a building that what I imagine would have maybe like a daycare in it on the bottom floor. So in beside it, I add a small plaza and a playground as well, just for some simple detailing. And of course, when putting trees in, trying to remember to also put in the tree grates if they were placed on a hardscape. Now this block had the French transformer building in it, which is quite short, and so I wanted to taper the block up with a couple shorter Mediterranean buildings and then bring them up gradually towards some higher buildings as we get towards the core of the city. Now with those last couple blocks filled in, I'm going to go through all of the odd spaces and fill them in with trees. And there we have it. That hill is almost completely developed. I do come in later and I work on the areas surrounding it, adding farms and vineyards and a few other buildings here and there, but that's the general process of how I was developing on hills. Again, in summary, I would pre-grade and I would build the road and I would place down narrow buildings, and then I would move them into place, recolor them as needed, and continue that process. I would repeat over and over. And so we'll end up skipping over some of the rest of the build and how I did this, because it does get quite repetitive, and I think you get the point. So in the next episode, we will skip over some of that, but I will look into some of the other more unique spaces. Kind of like this one here. I like how this little area worked out. It has this tight little block and parking worked in there and lots of the brick surface. It feels a little more unique compared to some of the other blocks in the area. I hope you enjoyed this episode. In the next one, I'll show how I built the Star Fort and have a quick look at a couple of other more unique locations you haven't seen yet. I'll leave you with some cinematics showing off how the area we built today looked in the end. Thank you for watching, take care, and happy building.